New York City's Great White Way, Broadway. Throughout the 1920s, the nightlife here glittered. Bands played, liquor flowed, and everyone who was drinking it was breaking the law. In the first month of the new decade, the 18th Amendment became the law of the land. The sale and consumption of alcohol was now illegal.
There was prohibition, but oddly enough, nobody paid any attention to it.
We went to people's homes and served dreadful things called orange blossoms, which was gin and orange juice for both. And bad gin, in fact.
Liquor was now sold behind closed doors in places called speakeasies. Proprietors took the risks and reaped the profits.
It was good money. I was 15 years old. I was riding around with a Nash convertible. We had 4 speakeasies. One by the Daily News, one by the Daily Mirror. You had the people, well, you let them in. Okay. The guy had to explain who he was and he'd show you an ID or something, and you let him in. You got to know it was like family after a while.
Every corner had a saloon on it. Of course, they were never raided. The cops were a big part of the business too. People wanted to drink. It was a great game.
It became a dangerous game for the high-stakes players. Battles between rival gangs for control of illegal liquor territories riddled American cities with mushrooming murder rates. Prohibition's aim was to sweep liquor off the city streets. Now they were flooded with gangsters and guns.
I used to carry 2 persuaders myself. Yeah, that happened. Or else.
Prohibition and the general disregard which followed it was the perfect symbol for the 20s, a decade which was about crossing the line, smashing tradition, breaking boundaries. As modern America came of age in the 1920s, boundaries of all sorts, technological, geographical, and social, were shattered.
Okay, welcome back to our conversations about Prohibition and the Roaring '20s. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes right now to take a look at some of the campaigns and advertisements and posters and communications in general that went out to the public with regards to Prohibition. And I wonder if you can glean something, like what are the implications of these advertisements upon what are the messages that they're trying to send out to people. So hit me up in the chat. What message is this advertising sending to people about alcohol? If you need a little bit more time, you're going to push pause right now and then think about what you would put in the chat if you're watching the recording. And hopefully maybe you're thinking about things like down here on the bottom right, this poster kind of makes you feel patriotic, like maybe not drinking alcohol is the patriotic thing to do. There was something called the Anti-Saloon League that was promoting that idea amongst others. There were other groups that were promoting the idea that alcohol was bad for the home. So you can see this down here, like implying that somehow like the traditional family was hurt by alcohol consumption. Over here, you kind of get the idea. This is a photograph taken of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And I think some of the implications here are that, pure women don't want men who drink. And then this specifically said, just kind of mocking God, this idea that breweries making claims about them being all natural, making use of natural resources is like kind of mocking mocking God and nature in general. Okay, away we go. So today we're going to continue our conversation about prohibition and its effects and how effective it actually was on the United States. So you guys already know that prohibition passed with the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, and that it lasts for about 13 years. And last time we were together, you heard words like speakeasies and bootleggers. And the speakeasies were these kind of illegal taverns and saloons that existed all over the place. And the bootleggers were people that were illegally transporting the now illegal alcohol, because of course alcohol continued to flow. So a little bit of background, because alcohol consumption is nothing new in this country. And in fact, there have been times in our history when alcohol consumption was higher than in the 1920s. And so here's just a little bit of information. In the early 1800s into the mid 1800s, the average male in the United States was drinking between 7 and 12 gallons per year, significantly higher than the alcohol consumption rate today. 7 to 12 gallons per year. Now, I will say that early on in our nation's history, water, it was difficult to maintain pure water. So if you go back into the 1700s and early 1800s, I mean, it wasn't uncommon for, children to drink a beer even, because the fermentation process protected the quality of the drink a little bit more so. So water could go bad and it could make you sick. And the fermentation process of like distilling alcohol kept it okay for longer. Okay, but anyway, significant alcohol consumption in the early 1800s and even into the 1880s and 1890s, we had significant alcohol consumption, especially, it already existed in the United States, so I guess I shouldn't say especially, but there were a significant proportion of the new immigrants that came into the country that's culture had as a part of its culture, a strong kind of alcohol consumption tradition. So for example, in the 1880s and 90s, we saw a lot of Irish immigrants come through. And the Irish immigrant tradition included in Ireland heavy alcohol consumption. We also saw a lot of German immigrants come through Ellis Island in this time period, and they actually became many of the national brewers in our nation. A lot of them have German heritage. But anyway, the Germans were beer drinkers. The Italian Americans that started to come through the door, they tended to be wine consumers. And so the different immigrant groups that came through had a cultural history of drinking different types of alcohol. And as they came into the nation, that alcohol consumption habit came with them as well. We had different organizations that had spotted alcohol as kind of an evil early on, or their perspective, it was an evil early on, because they felt like it disrupted the home. It led to men not being as able to work on the regular. It wasted money that could come into the home, and oftentimes led to kind of mistreatment of your family at home. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union has a fairly long history dating back to before the Civil War. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union all along the way has been saying for a long time that alcohol is just an evil. And primarily this is coming from a religious, kind of more traditional perspective, that they just want to protect the traditional home. And this is one of the ways to do it. In addition to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, there was also a newer group that emerged during World War I called the Anti-Saloon League. And the Anti-Saloon League, it came along with, some of you will remember that during World War I, Herbert Hoover was placed in charge of food and propaganda campaigns about what people should eat and what they shouldn't eat during the wartime. And grains that were used to create alcohol were really sought after during World War I to feed troops and to provide to countries overseas that were not able to produce, grain products for their citizens at the time. And so there was this huge push that it was patriotic to not drink alcohol and instead allow those grains to be used for foodstuffs instead. So the Anti-Saloon League started off as kind of patriotic war group during World War I, and then after World War I ended, of course, a new target became alcohol consumption. And so the Anti-Saloon League was also helping to push for the passage of the 18th Amendment, which actually comes just prior to World War I ending. So in August 19th of 1917, the Senate actually passes the 18th Amendment. It's going to take another 9 months or so before enough states have approved it for it to be ratified and to be like the law of the land. But by 1917, we were passing that through the Senate. And by 1918, it is the law of the land. Now, there were a lot of loopholes because this 18th Amendment made it illegal to transport, sell, and produce alcohol, but it didn't necessarily make it illegal for an individual person to consume. And so there were a lot of little loopholes that that people found in order to continue drinking. So for example, churches were still able to have wine as part of their Catholic services, and pharmacies were still allowed to provide alcohol for people who had a prescription. So during this time period, people with anxieties and pains and things like that could actually receive a doctor's note that said that that they were allowed to consume alcohol. So kind of like for medicinal purposes, like we view maybe the use of marijuana today, for the same sort of reasons, anxiety and pain. So the number of pharmacies in New York, for example, tripled under this kind of loophole, because in addition to the pharmacies that were doing, by the nature what it was intended for, there were also bootleggers and organized crime that opened up pharmacies and used them as a front to just continue to sell alcohol. And then all they had to do was get people to write prescriptions, right? And continue to produce and sell. So personal consumption on an individual level was not illegal, but getting caught transporting and creating it for sale, that was illegal and could lead to thousands of dollars in fines and years in prison. However, prohibition is fairly short-lived, and there's lots of reasons as to why. One of them has to do with economics. I mean, people had been utilizing alcohol for raising tax revenues at both the national and state levels for a long time. It was said in one of the articles that I read that New York, the state of New York's tax collection dropped by nearly 70% when all of a sudden alcohol was illegal and they couldn't tax it any longer. So lost revenue was one of the problems with prohibition, because all of a sudden there wasn't alcohol legally able to be taxed. They say across the nation that accounted for about $11 billion in today's money losses. And it cost the nation about $300 million to try to enforce the new laws that they put into place. So we're losing tax revenue and creating new agencies that are attempting to enforce this new law that has been created. There were all kinds of legal loopholes that made it really difficult for the federal government to enforce and protect people the way that they had intended to protect people. So there was little they could do about the fact that pharmacies tripled and that people were kind of using these loopholes to continue to produce and sell alcohol. So what it looked like to the regular kind of community member is that, it was business as usual. And so you're out money, you're spending money, and people are still continuing to kind of drink as per normal. It wasn't difficult to get. Some of the probably the most visually staunch images that will be right in people's faces as far as changes around prohibition is that organized crime took over and violence on the streets increased. Now that the government wasn't organizing and kind of controlling the movement and selling of alcohol, organized crime, it just went kind of underground. And so black markets emerged where other people were organizing and moving that alcohol around. And organized crime took over in a lot of large cities. This is when people like Bugsy Moran and Al Capone are out there kind of organizing in big cities to make sure that they control territory and to deliver alcohol and make money off of it. And so in order to control that, there was a lot of violence amongst those gangsters, and that looked like making the streets unsafe for the regular kind of average American. In addition, the black market alcohol that was out there being produced wasn't regulated by the federal government, and so in some cases it was actually more dangerous. Since it wasn't kind of overseen by a process, there were a variety of new people trying to make, and as a result, that alcohol could be more dangerous. Much like kind of the shift recently to different types of marijuanas and how those different strains can have different impacts. And now that it is regulated, I think there's a little bit more oversight over people knowing what they're getting. This is a picture of downtown Centralia in the 1920s, and you can see the Oli Club is here. And I just wanted you to see that right in your own backyard, the Oli Club's license was revoked because they got caught with liquor, kind of in violation of this Prohibition time period. I think another thing that is kind of harder to put your finger upon is that it just became kind of the fad. It became kind of popular if you were kind of with the in crowd, that people kind of poked fun of Prohibition and continued to do what they wanted. One more thing to consider is that the amount of money the federal government was willing to spend trying to enforce the new laws, officially called the Volstead Act, but the 18th Amendment of the Constitution, the way that they hired, it wasn't nearly enough. And so organized crime had more firepower, more men, and the police were kind of unable to effectively run enforcement because there weren't enough of them, and organized crime had more power. And I think this is one of the most dangerous things about Prohibition, is that if the laws are being kind of flouted, then maybe in this case it's about Prohibition, but what comes next? So if the law enforcement can't hold organized crime responsible for, Prohibition, then why should your average citizen follow the law with regards to just about anything? A literal bootleg of alcohol. Okay. Alcohol consumption actually did go down during Prohibition. It kind of goes against what I think we believe we know about Prohibition, but alcohol consumption actually did go down, just because it was a little bit harder to get for your average American, I guess. You had to want to go out and find it, and just because it was illegal, some people actually didn't consume. So alcohol consumption did actually decrease. And that's where we're going to stop. Thank you.